All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here today. This is our third Housing Roundtable webinar called Creating a Housing Conservancy Toolbox. My name is Yarrow Brown. I'm the Executive Director of Housing North, and we're really excited to share this webinar with you today. I'm not going to spend too much time on your updates, as our July newsletter will highlight many of these. We're trying a new format today, and so be patient with us as we work out some of the tweaks here. Please make sure, I think we muted your microphones automatically. Submit any questions that you have during the presentation via the chat function, and we will monitor that. And at the end, we will have a poll question. So if you could please participate in that, and we'll show the results. And then if we have time as questions, at the end of the presentation, we'll answer questions for you. I just want to give you a brief introduction, and then we'll get into the agenda. See if I can advance the slide here. As many of you know, Housing North was formed about 1.5 years ago to address barriers to housing development in our area. Our mission is to create pathways and partnerships for housing in Northwest Michigan. Our goal is to build awareness, influence policy, and expand our capacity so communities can create housing solutions that meet their unique needs. Steve, if you can try to advance the slide. For some reason, I'm not able to do it on this end. There we go. And then the next slide, please. So I just want to go over today what we are going to cover. We're going to cover deed restrictions to ensure long-term affordability and year-round occupancy. And Steve Schnell with our Charlevoix County Housing Ready program will talk about that. We're also going to delve into community land trusts, which are to retain ownership of the land and ensure long-term affordability. And Jane MacKenzie from Northern Homes Community Development Corporation will talk on that subject. And then Sarah Lucas, our founding executive director, will talk about land bank partnerships to support land acquisition and development in partnership with county land banks, land bank authorities, local units of government. And she'll also talk about housing funds to support pre-development, land acquisition, and development costs. So now I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk about our deed restriction program.
And I'm not able to advance the slide on my end. I was working just a moment ago.
Let me try this here.
Control again.
I guess I do. It's pausing. Let me try. Hold on 1 second here. I don't know what's happening.
And we tested this, of course, and it worked just great about a minute ago.
Okay. So try again. You just maybe. Oops. I'm going to try to share my screen again. I'll try that again.
And while she's doing that, I'll introduce myself. I work for the Charlevoix County Housing Ready program. Assistance is provided by the cities of Charlevoix, East Jordan, Boyne City, County of Charlevoix, and a couple of foundations, the Fry Foundation and the Charlevoix County Community Foundation. So we're really, I'm excited to be in this position. I've been here for a few months, unfortunately all during the COVID-19 lockdown, but I've had a lot of chance to start to get to know people, and I'm excited to keep going on some of these projects. One of the very first projects we did was a deed restriction program to preserve primary residences in the city of Charlevoix. As everybody's probably aware, there's a lot of demand for housing out there, and a lot of the demand that's out there is not met on the open market. So what do we do to meet that need? Oftentimes there needs to be an injection of some other type of investment or funding, whether that be taxpayer dollars or private donations. And a big part of getting that type of investment is to guarantee that that investment is protected in the long term. So we want to make sure that the goals of whatever housing program is getting that investment, that those goals are being met for a long, long time. And in this case, thank you, the City of Charlevoix Year-Round Housing Deed Restriction Program, the city has a goal of creating more year-round housing and more workforce housing. The city has been rather proactive at this for a few years. They assembled a committee just a few years ago called the Charlevoix Housing and Business Park Initiative. And it's a really unique partnership of stakeholders in the economic development of city of Charlevoix. So they have people that own land in the industrial park. They have local elected officials. They have township officials, the Chamber of Commerce, local business owners, residents. There have quite a few, and the Housing Commission is represented. There's a lot of people with a stake in the future of the city of Charlevoix that are part of this initiative. And their vision is really groundbreaking because they really understand that economic development and housing go hand in hand. You can't convince new businesses to come to your area if they can't hire new people. And if they can hire new people, you need a place for them to live. And Charlevoix has a real challenge there, which we'll talk about in a minute. But basically, they want to make sure that there's more long-term housing available for the local workforce. So to meet that need, if we can advance the slide, thank you. To meet that need, the City of Charlevoix, Housing North, all looked for examples. How have other people done this successfully? And some great examples are in the mountain towns of Colorado, which for quite a while now, the Vail program, there's been various Vail programs to preserve workforce housing, starting in the late 80s, where they've done deed restrictions of various kinds. The Vail and Deed program is the one that we've modeled after for the city of Charlevoix. It just started about 2 or 3 years ago. They've worked out a lot of kinks over the last 30 years in the various other programs, and this one has been pretty successful. The town of Vail, they use revenue from sales and real estate taxes, and they purchase deed restrictions on properties. And the deed restriction, essentially, the primary restriction on that property, which is worth money to the town of Vail and to the future of Vail, is that the property must be occupied as a primary residence by a person who works at least 30 hours per week in Eagle County. A lot of times when we talk affordable housing or attainable workforce housing, there's often price caps. This one, their concern is simply that the occupant of the property be an employee within Eagle County, which is the larger county that Vail exists within. So in this case, there's no price appreciation cap. The owner of the property realizes 100% of all the price appreciation for that property, but that deed does stay with the property. Next slide, please. It'll come up here in just a second. So, but I'll continue to talk. It works in such a way that each restriction is negotiated with the property owner. It starts with an appraisal of the property. It's typically about 15% of the home's value. And in this case, a lot of these properties are right in the $300,000 to $400,000 range that have these deed restrictions on them, or the people are selling. It's oftentimes a townhome. So it's oftentimes about $50,000 approximately on average that property owners are receiving. And one of the requirements is that whatever property the deed restriction is being purchased for, it must meet the town priorities and be in alignment with the adopted housing strategy. And this is something that they're updating all the time. Their strategy reaches out typically about 10 years, and it basically effectuates, or it describes the goals and objectives of what the town wants to see happen in their housing supply. And that can change over time. So it could be that the specifics of that deed restriction or the value or the contribution of that changes as new people purchase into the program and get their cash. But either way, whatever that deed restriction is at the time that it's agreed upon, that particular deed restriction stays with the title. It survives ownership, and it stays with that property forever. Okay, next, thank you. So the beauty of this program is it can use existing homes and land. So if somebody wants to purchase a home that's already been built and they're simply buying into it, but they need a little extra cash to close the funding gap, they can voluntarily agree to have this deed restriction placed on that property upon purchase of that land. So you can go through that application process, get approved, and the cash would happen upon purchase. Or it can also go to an existing resident. So say you already own a condo or a home and you want to do some improvements, you don't have the money to do it, and you're willing to voluntarily enter into a deed restriction program, you would receive cash for that, and you can go ahead with those improvements. Now, with any of these programs, you'll hear about other programs next, but for deed restriction programs, there has to be an enforcement aspect to this. It sounds harsh, but it is very important because a deed restriction, if it goes for a number of years without any enforcement, essentially it becomes unenforceable over time. The courts would not support any a deed restriction that has intermittently been enforced. So there is some administrative cost to this over the long term. And it's a very long term because it goes essentially for 99 years of the, in essence, in perpetuity for that land and that property. Typically, it's an annual review. Oftentimes, it's an affidavit that's signed and notarized by the owners showing that they've been both employed locally for the Vail program and that they've been inhabiting the property for at least 9 out of 12 months. If somebody is found to be non-compliant, there's a whole system that they go through with follow-up letters, certified letters, and then eventually they can forfeit the property. Luckily, they haven't had that happen very often, if at all. And so it's been, but some enforcement does take a little extra time. So there's some administrative cost to this. Next slide, please. So with the city of Charlevoix, it's slightly different, but definitely along the same lines. This one is in response to a growing percentage of summer homes and vacation rentals. And the most recent data that I've received from the city of Charlevoix indicates that only 38% of the homes in the community right now are inhabited by people that live there year round. Now, all of us are familiar with the idea that people have vacation homes up north. This is just the nature of living in a beautiful area like ours. But City of Charlevoix definitely has a little bit more of a unique challenge, given that less than half, only 38%, almost as low as 1/3 of their homes are available for the workforce. So that really limits, it drives up prices, it really limits the choice that people have when they're moving to the community. Oftentimes it forces them outside of the community and makes them a longer commute. So the City of Charlevoix, Housing North, Charlevoix County Community Foundation all decided, well, let's work together, let's try to figure out a way to fix this. And we together created more housing that, in the long term, that will be available for a primary residence. Next slide, thank you. So this deed restriction program, there's been, we'll talk about the first project that occurred back in April, but the funding came from a private donor, and we're looking for more donations to this program to build it out in the long term. The donation was made to Housing North through the Charlevoix County Community Foundation. And to steward this, the deed holder is Housing North. We are a nonprofit, and this is one of the services that we provide. So we will do the annual compliance monitoring. Some of the enforcement we will handle, and some of the enforcement will be shared. It could be shared by the city. The city is listed in the deed restriction as a third-party beneficiary of that deed restriction. So if things wind up in court and foreclosures need to happen, which hopefully never happen, that is something, that enforcement effort could be shared by the city. The first project occurred in April of this year. It happened very quickly, and it was very fortunate that everything came together very well. There was a church in a residential area that is going to be converted to a 3-unit apartment building. And it's only a portion of the property that has this deed restriction. There's actually a small home on the property also that is not subject to this deed restriction. So that's another option. You can create this deed restriction over a portion of the land. The payment to the owner was 15% of the purchase price, and that was negotiated based on the area of the land that was being restricted by the deed restriction. The rental units, the owner of the property does not have to be the actual resident of it, but whoever does rent from those units has to have this as their primary residence. So they will be able to have renters that live there year-round and be in compliance. Most likely this project will start in the spring of 2021, because there is some reconstruction that has to happen on this property. But we're looking forward to seeing how this works and seeing this success. We're especially excited that these are rental units that will be available for the workforce right away, beginning next year. Next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce Jane MacKenzie. Jane's with the Northern Homes Community Development Corporation, and she's going to talk a little bit about community land trusts.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Yarrow and Housing North, for inviting me to share a community land trust story today. Next slide, please. So first, a little bit about Northern Homes. We've been in business for over 20 years. We serve a 6-county area, and we overlap with Housing North on Antrim, Charlevoix, and Emmett counties. And we also, in our service areas, also Sheboygan, Otsego, and Crawford counties. We have 3 major programs. We build and manage apartments. We have a home buyer education program. We are a HUD certified housing counseling agency with HUD certified counselors. And our 3rd program is our single family development program, and that's where the community land trust program is. So I'm going to start with an overview of what a community land trust is, and then go into specifics about our program. Next slide, please. So there are over 200 community land trust programs nationwide. Because it is, across the country, there's quite a bit of variety in the programs, but there are things that they have in common. And number 1 is that all community land trusts are nonprofit community-based organizations, and they're designed to ensure the community stewardship of land. CLTs can be used for many types of development, including commercial and industrial, but they're primarily used to ensure long-term housing affordability. When we started our community land trust, we were focused on the affordability aspect of it and using the CLT as a tool for affordable housing. But now community ownership of the land is becoming more important facet of this tool. And down in the bottom corner there's a link to groundedsolutions.org, which is a great website, great resource for more information on community land trusts. At that website, you can just kind of skim the surface and learn a little bit more about community land trusts, or you can take a deep dive there and really get into some research papers. Next slide. So a little more about the community land trust model. On the left-hand side, you have the traditional purchase of a home where you buy the land and the house, the whole kit and caboodle all together in one purchase transaction. On the right-hand side, we're talking about a community land trust, and that's where the ownership of the house and the land is separated. The community land trust organization holds the deed to the land, and the homeowner gets a bill of sale for the improvements on the land for the house. And the relationship between the owner of the house and the owner of the land is defined in a contract that's called a ground lease. So next slide. So a typical community land trust for affordable housing, you start with step 1. The community land trust purchases either vacant land or land with a house already on it and builds a house, rehabs what's there. Step 2, the family, the household purchases the improvements, but not the land. And the purchase price is more affordable because the homeowner is only buying the house and not the land. And because a nonprofit community land trust is involved, additional grants can be brought to bear on the project, which can further reduce the price of the house. And then during the sale, step number 3, the community land trust and the homeowner enter into a 99-year ground lease. And that ground lease is really the key to the whole program. So I'm going to talk about Northern Homes program to specifically talk about a specific situation. So our land trust program began in 2003. We are a scattered site community land trust with 15 homes in 4 communities in 2 counties. And there's an example of, we purchased an existing house in East Jordan and did a major rehab to it. It is still in our community land trust program. So we continue to own the land and the homeowner owns the house. Next slide. So the process for a new construction home, which there's an example there on the screen, we bought the land, built the house, and then sold the house and entered into a 99-year ground lease with stipulations on the use, the ownership, the ground lease fee, and the resale of the home. A community land trust does require ongoing stewardship, and some of the things that we do ongoing is we monitor the tax payment, the ground lease fee payment, refinance requests, and resales. So again, we sell the improvements only and retain the ownership of the land. Next slide. So there is a model ground lease that's out there. So I'm going to go into more detail about the key document, the ground lease. And there is a model ground lease that you can find at that groundedsolutions.org website. But the different communities tweak that ground lease to fit their situation. It depends on the local market and also on the local housing goals. So our ground lease has stipulations that the home buyer must abide by, and they include that it has to be owner occupied. It has to be the principal place of residence, so not a second home. They need to sell the household. When they decide to sell the house, they need to sell it to a household with income that's less than 80% of the area median income. Now the 80% restriction is on there because of the initial subsidy funding that we used for the project. If we hadn't used that particular pot of money, we could still set our own restrictions, maybe at 100% of the area median income, or 120%. But the idea is to continue with affordability for these houses. The crucial part of the ground lease is the resale formula, and our resale formula is appraisal based. And so there's an appraisal when they buy the house, and that is compared to the appraisal when they go to sell the house. And the owner gets 22% of the increase in value of between the two appraisals. The remainder of the increase in value stays with the property to keep it affordable. So if you don't have a goal of affordability, then you can use a different resale formula. But all resales need to be monitored. The Community Land Trust really steps in at that point. Next slide. So here's a specific example that happened this year. We had a house that the owner requested a resale. I'll answer your question later, Marilyn. I see your note. So the initial appraisal 14 years ago in 2006 was $140,000. The appraisal this year was $202,000. So according to our formula, the seller gets 22% of the increase in value. So if you take $202,000 minus 140, you get $62,200. 22% of that $62,000 is $13,684. That's what the homeowner gets to walk away with at the resale, at the time selling it to the next person. To figure out what the new sale price is going to be, you start with the original sale price, which in this case was $92,000. We add the $13,684 to it, and that equals $105,000. So a house that appraised this year for $202,000, we were able to sell for $105,000. What this also illustrates is how that subsidy increases over time. So when it sold initially in 2006, 14 years ago, the appraised value was $140,000, but the purchase price was $92,000. So that's a $48,000 difference. This year, appraised at $202, sold at $105, that's a $96,000 difference. So it increased, the subsidy increased from $48,000 to $96,000 without having to go to outside sources for additional subsidy. So the shared appreciation allows that subsidy to grow along with the increase in value of the house. Next slide, please. So our ground lease also says that the Northern Homes has the right to repurchase the home according to that resale formula, but we usually don't step in between buyers. We let the current buyer sell it to the new buyer, and we just, the current owner sell it to the new buyer, and we just facilitate that transaction. So the ground lease really is the mechanism that enforces the restrictions, that keeps the subsidy in place, which ensures the long-term affordability from buyer to buyer. And portions of the subsidy include the cost of the land, the shared equity, and any other grants that we use to make the project happen. The ground lease also keeps it local, and I think that's really important. So this is one of those cases where, you know, a tree planted in this generation is appreciated by future generations. So in this case, a house that is built now is kept local and affordable for all future home buyers. And that's the end of my presentation. Next slide.
Hey. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Lucas with Housing North. I, as of next week, I'm the former executive director of Housing North. I'm moving on. But while I'm here, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how land banks play into some of these concepts that we're talking about related to land preservation and ownership, and how we can facilitate them with a housing fund. And I don't know if I have control over my slides, but if I do not, if you could advance to the next slide, that would be great. So Steve and Jane talked about deed restrictions and community land trusts, and what those two tools have in common is land. They both provide a way to maintain ownership or control over the land or the property in one way or another, which is very similar to what a conservancy does, which a land conservancy, as we know, saves land over the long term or even forever. And they use a variety of tools to do that, things like conservation easements and land purchases and purchase of development rights. So most people are pretty familiar with how conservancies work when you're looking at preserving land. The concept of a housing conservancy is newer and maybe a little bit more complicated, but has in common with a nature conservancy the idea of using land to create a long-term community benefit. So one of the things that we talk about at Housing North, and in pretty much every conversation about housing, affordable housing or workforce housing, anytime there's housing investment, there's a lot of interest in how we make sure that that investment remains available to the community, how housing remains affordable, what are the long-term mechanisms to make sure that that happens. So that's why we've really ended up talking more and more about things like community land trusts and deed restrictions and other land-based tools that give us some control over the property. One of the organizations out there that has been maybe out ahead of these conversations at a greater extent than others is the Urban Land Conservancy, which is based in Denver. Some of you who attended the Housing Summit last year in Traverse City heard from the Urban Land Conservancy CEO who explained the organization, which is a nonprofit, and how they've taken the idea of a conservancy and applied it to housing and community development. They have a mission of providing a long-term community benefit. They do that by acquiring land and then holding it until it's ready for new development or redevelopment by a nonprofit or a community partner. Urban Land Conservancy, by being involved, can help partners obtain additional financing. They can help with the development process with things like pre-development and site planning, financing, construction, and in some cases, they actually act as the developer. Once the project is completed, the Urban Land Conservancy retains a ground lease through a separate CLT, which is not quite theirs. It's under their umbrella, but it's a separate organization. But it provides a deed restriction and a ground lease to ensure that the property is used for community benefit long-term. So they're a combination of a nonprofit developer and a community land trust and also a land bank. In a lot of ways, if you could go to the next slide, please. In a lot of ways, they're similar to a traditional nonprofit developer, but they have a role in strategically acquiring property in key locations that that they know is going to be good for development, good for affordable housing, accessible to transportation, accessible to jobs, buying that property, and then incorporating a community land trust mechanism into new developments, which brings that conservancy element into the equation. So they buy land and hold it until there's partners and financing ready for redevelopment or new development. And because they retain ownership over the land long-term through that CLT, they can control what does and doesn't happen there. So in a lot of ways, even though they're developing the property, sometimes in partnership, sometimes on their own, they act like a land bank by buying and holding property. Next slide, please. So the Urban Land Conservancy is a really interesting model. They're a nonprofit. They're funded, or were funded initially by a large endowment from a private donor. So they're replicable to some extent, but just the scale of their activities and the funds available to them is not something that's immediately obtainable for our region. So it's I think a great goal to strive for in terms of having that resource available. But in the meantime, while we don't have an Urban Land Conservancy equivalent in Michigan, we can apply the general idea using community land bank authorities. And I know many of you are very familiar with what land bank authorities are. They're organized at the county level under legislation that was created to address tax foreclosed properties that eventually end up in county ownership. Because there are so many problems with tax foreclosed properties, by and large, there's a lot of underlying issues related to their development and sale. Land bank authorities have access to a number of tools that support new development or redevelopment. So with a land bank authority, a county can acquire and hold property tax-free until it's ready for development. They can clear title, they can remediate the property, they can find tenants, they can do whatever they need to do to get that property ready for sale or development. And the big incentive with a land bank authority, and one of the most important tools available in the land bank authority toolbox, is that any property that a land bank owns, whether the county came into ownership of it through foreclosure or donation or actually just buying the land, it's classified as a brownfield property, which makes it which makes it eligible for financial incentives that can help prepare it for new development or redevelopment and offset some development costs, which is really important in affordable housing development. Next slide, please. We have 7 land bank authorities in our region. We have a 10-county region. There's only a few counties that have an established one. Some of the 7 that do exist have been really active as development partners. Just to give you a couple examples of how they've worked with nonprofits, a few years ago, the Grand Traverse County Land Bank Authority worked with Habitat for Humanity and Homestretch to develop a piece of property that was owned by the city. The Land Bank Authority helped buy the land, and they helped develop infrastructure. And the site's now home to over 30 energy efficient homes that are affordable to a range of incomes, from 60% of area median income on up to market rate homes. Another example is in Leelanau County, where they actually have had a few projects. The Land Bank Authority has been working in partnership both with Leelanau Reach, a local nonprofit, and Habitat for Humanity to provide land, and then some of the tax benefits that come with a land bank authority for the construction of new homes. So they've really, they've been really active and supportive of new housing development there in Leelanau County. Charlevoix County has actually used theirs for housing development. Manistee County is working with Habitat for Humanity, and Benzie County is interested in using theirs as well. So there's a lot of, I think, excitement about what land bank authorities can bring to the table. If you could go to the next slide, please. And we've actually done quite a bit of education and discussion about how land bank authorities work and how they might help support housing development. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the process. We are happy to offer additional webinars or educational events on land bank authorities at the local level if anyone's interested. But today I just kind of want to briefly outline how a land bank authority works and why they're important to development. Basically, a land bank authority can take ownership of a property through tax foreclosure after a very lengthy process. They can buy land, or land can be donated to them. And once it's in their ownership, particularly if it's a purchase or a donation on their part, the Land Bank Authority enters into an agreement with a developer, generally a nonprofit or potentially a private sector partner, to stipulate how the land can be used. They can act as a developer, and they do in larger communities, but in our region, they by and large don't want to for obvious reasons. When they do enter into an agreement on how the land can be used, they provide some stipulations about long-term affordability or affordability to certain income levels or long-term occupancy, whatever goals the community is trying to achieve with new development on those land bank owned parcels. They build that into an agreement with the development partner, so that there might be clawback restrictions if the developer doesn't deliver, essentially. So you can say in the agreement that you have to build 20 homes on the property by X date, and if the developer doesn't follow through, then that property ends up permanent, or it goes back into ownership of the Land Bank Authority. The other thing to know about this process is that the land bank can subsidize some of the development. They can pay for some of the development costs or infrastructure costs up front, and then repay themselves with tax capture once the property is sold. So the property comes into land bank ownership. It's developed in an agreement with a nonprofit or other developer. The property is deeded back to that nonprofit developer and then sold. And once it's in private ownership, the county collects taxes on it. For 5 years, half of the taxes go into a special fund, which can be used to repay the subsidy that the land bank has provided. So it's a really complicated process, but it does work really well. If you could go to the next slide, please. As we saw with some of the examples in our region, it's generally done in partnerships with nonprofits, and it's generally a pretty lengthy process. There's been a lot of interest in expanding this as a tool and offering it, as a way to incentivize more development, including with more private sector partners. The problem is it generally takes staff or capacity that a lot of county land banks don't have. Land bank authorities are housed in the county treasurer's office. They're not developers. Very few of our communities have community development staff. So they're not, equipped in terms of staff to actually negotiate development and be project managers, essentially, is what it takes to make this happen. So in Charlevoix County, where Steve has been working as a Housing Ready Program Director, we've been exploring ways that a third party can help bring land bank tools to the table for both private and nonprofit developers in partnership with the county and local governments. So kind of supporting the idea of a housing conservancy by creating a way to acquire and hold land for development. So we've actually had, questions and interest from property owners or developers who have a piece of property. They want to see it developed. They want to work in partnership with nonprofits, working together with the Land Bank Authority. They can access additional funding to support that development. But it typically takes, another partner to make that happen. If you could go to the next slide, please. Another thing to know about land bank authorities, particularly in our region, because we have a good example here, is that because they can capture taxes, they can also be connected to housing funds. And this has actually been done in Grand Traverse County, which created a housing trust fund about 10 years ago. For those of you that aren't familiar, housing trust funds are set up by local, county, or state governments to accept dedicated public revenues for specific housing needs. So there's generally a new source of revenue that is earmarked for housing that goes into this fund that can only be used for housing. They've been really, really effective and really important in getting projects started and providing gap financing and in leveraging additional dollars. So they're one of the most important tools out there in terms of housing development, because, after all, the big problem that we're trying to solve is financial, the cost of development. So we need a financial tool. But at any rate, the concept of a housing trust fund is something that's been out there for a long time. And there are lots of examples throughout the country of where they exist. In Michigan, we only have a few examples. There was one in Ann Arbor. There was the Grand Traverse County Housing Trust Fund, which was connected to the proceeds from the sale of tax foreclosed properties. And then recently Kalamazoo created a housing trust fund with funding from a property millage, which is, to my knowledge, the first time that's been done in Michigan. In our region, they're kind of difficult to get traction on. They require a lot of hands-on from the county. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of staff that can help with that. But really the big problem with creating a local housing trust fund in Michigan is that local governments don't have that many options for generating revenue. If you could go to the next slide, please. So regardless of whether local governments decide to play a role in creating a housing fund or not, the need for them is not going away. Development costs are high and public funding is really competitive. So we need an additional funding source to close the financing gap, to subsidize the high cost of development, to act as a risk pool, to buy land, to help with pre-development. There's always going to be a financial gap when we're talking about building housing for low and moderate and even in some cases average incomes. So we know that we need this funding source. Regardless of what tools we have available to us, we know that there's going to be the need for an additional financial tool. If you could go to the next slide, please. It's not that we don't have any options or that we don't have any tools. We actually have a lot of partners who are really engaged and that can help us with some of these different financing pieces. There's the state, Michigan State Housing Development Authority and the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, both of which provide grants and low interest loans. There are community development finance institutions, which provide low interest loans and patient capital and can be really helpful in leveraging additional financing. There's philanthropy that provide grants primarily to specific projects. So these are all the traditional partners in financing for housing that we've worked with for years and have been, side by side with our nonprofits and other community advocates as we work to create housing. But a lot of us in this region have talked about the potential to bring other partners to the table, like employers and businesses as investors or donors, which could be a game changer in terms of the amount of dollars available for housing development. Employers have a huge stake in housing. They know it. They know it's one of their biggest barriers in terms of, hiring a workforce, maintaining a workforce, expanding their business. Everything starts with housing, and they are acutely aware of it. And a lot of them have been partners, either buying housing or actually looking to be partners in housing development. So we think that there's the potential to bring employers in as finance partners as well. The problem is there hasn't been a real mechanism or a single entity that can coordinate that employer investment. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So we've been spending a lot of time with partners working to identify the best vehicle for attracting donations and investment, particularly from employers and those other non-traditional partners. And what we really essentially are trying to do is build a multi-sector housing fund, not just a housing trust fund that's owned and operated, I guess, by the local unit of government, but something that can attract investment and donations from multiple partners and then leverage that for additional financing. There's been a lot of questions about how a fund like that might work, where it might be housed, who would do the fundraising, what it could be used for. There's been, a lot of solutions and opportunities presented. We've talked about working with community foundations, and I think that presents some real opportunities, especially for specific projects. Like certain developments, like we heard about in Mackinac Island, where the community foundation really kind of initiated a workforce housing project. But we've learned from other communities that it can be hard for community foundations to change their model to deal with large investments and loans rather than those project-specific grants, especially for housing projects, which generally have a lot of risk involved. So, there's also been a lot of interest in working with CDFIs who have the infrastructure and expertise to administer funds and underwrite projects. But they don't have the local staff to coordinate the fundraising, the local investment, or the employer contributions. Next slide, please. We've been learning about other models that kind of take all of those pieces and all of those partners and provide the best of all worlds by creating a fund that would be administered by CDFIs and closely connected to local philanthropy, public agencies, and local players, like some of the grassroots committees like Steve described. These models generally use a sort of intermediary that can help with fundraising from local investors, and then the dollars are administered by CDFIs that can attract conventional financing and public funding, potentially in partnership with land bank authorities that can hold land acquired with dollars from that fund. Sounds complicated, and it is. If you go to the next slide, please. But we have, as we've talked around these options and, looked at the tools that are available to us now, looked at the partners that are available to us now, what some of the gaps are, the problems that we're trying to solve, we come back to this sort of umbrella concept of a conservancy. In order to use the tools that we talked about, like the deed restrictions, the community land trust, or even land bank authorities, we need a funding source, and we also need a partner that can access or apply those tools. So having this funding model could create a vehicle that would enable property donations that could then trigger the use of those conservancy tools like deed restrictions and community land trusts. And it could also offer funds for the purchase of land or other pre-development activity that we need to initiate new housing development. So we see the creation of a housing conservancy as a way to bring all of those things together, all of those land-based tools, and then support them with dollars from a locally sourced fund. If you could go to the next slide, please. This might be my last one. No, this is my last one. No more slides. So we've been, like I said, exploring this in partnership with a lot of different agencies and nonprofits and local governments. The idea has really evolved over the last year. We think we have a much more clear direction on what's needed, but we still have some questions to sort out in terms of how best to partner with CDFIs, what geography makes the most sense, both for a fund or for any of the tools we've talked about. Like, do we do this at the county level, or do we do this at a 10 county level? There's pros and cons with either scale. We've talked a lot about how many dollars we really need. That's the eternal question. How much all of this will cost, how we raise funds initially, and what capacity we need locally or regionally to make the right connections and begin fundraising. So we're exploring those questions now in partnership with CDFIs and community foundations and others, both in the region and throughout the state, who are finding themselves with very similar questions. And we plan to bring more detailed discussions and hopefully some answers to future housing roundtables and the Housing Summit. So we will, continue to work on that. We hope to have more information to share in the near future, but today we're just kind of putting the questions out there for discussion about how a fund might be used to facilitate the use of some of these other land-based tools that are out there. So I'll stop there, and I think we have some time for questions and I think a poll. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Sarah. We are going to start a poll right now and ask you to answer those questions. So stay on just a moment and then we will share the results. I'm going to run the poll right now. Gonna give it till about a few more minutes to see if everybody that wants to answer has answered, and then I'll share the results. Okay, last chance to answer the poll. I'm going to close it in about 7 seconds. All right. I'm going to share the results so you can all see. And let me see, I'll make it big here so we can digest them for just a minute. And we will also share these with you in the recorded video and in a follow-up. So you will get a copy of these. Give just a minute to look at those results. I'm going to stop sharing for just now. And well, thank you, everybody. We have a couple minutes left if anybody wants to ask a burning question or has any questions for one of the speakers. If you do, you can submit it via chat. Let's see here. I think what we'll do is respond to some of those questions after this webinar and in a follow-up email. But I just want to thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate your support and participation. Our next webinar that we are planning will be on August 6th at 2 p.m. and the title will be Only Homes Will End Homelessness. Ashley Halliday-Schmant of the Northwest Michigan Coalition to End Homelessness will introduce the coalition and discuss members' work and services, along with ideas for moving forward with housing partners. And in partnership with Networks Northwest, we will have our housing summit this year. It will be virtual, so look for a save the date coming out shortly. It will be on October 20th to 22nd. And here are the contact information for all the people on the webinar today. Thank you all again for attending.
I think there's a couple questions in the chat that maybe we could just take a couple of minutes to go through. Emily asked if existing land conservancies could take on a role in any of these tools. And they have been a part of the conversations in some communities more than others. But I think that they are, and someone can maybe jump in if they're more familiar, but what we have found is that because their mission is based on preserving land, it's a little bit more difficult for them to make the leap into saving homes. But they've been very supportive of working as partners. And I think that that's a concept that needs to be explored a little bit more. I know that they have just as many problems with housing their workforce as anybody else. And so this is a very real issue for them as well. But yes, they have been a part of the conversation, and I think will continue to be partners. Then there were a couple questions on CLTs and how they're handled by local assessors. It looks like Jane has answered a couple of those questions. And I don't know if we'd like to have a little bit more discussion on that, but the short version there is that local assessors do treat community land trust properties differently. So it's not always very predictable. We've talked with Jane and with others about getting some, clear guidance from the state on how community land trusts should be addressed by local taxes, whether they're considered non-homestead or, as we believe, as homestead properties. So that's something that's out there. And like Jonathan mentioned in chat, it's a good idea to talk to local assessors before doing anything with a community land trust, just to get a handle on how they address that. So I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on some of those questions, but happy to continue the conversation if there's interest.
Yeah, it looks like also addressing Emily's question about the Vail program when somebody retires and or becomes unemployed or disabled. I can't answer the disabled question. My understanding is there are some exceptions that their review board can look at. But as far as retirement goes, the person has to own the home for 5 years prior to retirement for them to be able to remain in the home during their retirement. So as long as they plan on doing that, if there's some unexpected unemployment or disability, I can look into that and find out what some of those exceptions might be that they grant. But yeah, there is a plan for that.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you everyone. And if you do want to reach out to any of us, we will share the slide after this presentation and the slides, and you can contact Steve, Sarah, myself, Jane, or Lisette. So thank you very much.
Thanks everybody for joining us today.